The lane is narrow and the hedge is high. And the sound isn't thunder, it's something new, a rhythmic clatter and an impatient hiss. A man in a blue coat pumps the pedals of his bicycle hard, because the law says the future must move no faster than a walking man. The car ahead is doing 8. The law says 2. He is closing, jacket snapping, cap low against the wind. When the constable catches the driver near East Peckham, they don't argue about what the machine is or what it might become. They argue about numbers. 8 against 2. A summons, a fine, 1 shilling plus costs. January 1896. On that winter morning, the story of Britain and the motorcar can be told as a chase. The state on a bicycle, the future in a car. A hedge on both sides to keep the view narrow. That hedge had a name. 30 years earlier, Parliament fenced the road with paper and called it safety. The Locomotives Act of 1865 said mechanical road vehicles, steam, smoke, sparks, frightening to horses, could not be trusted in traffic unless they behaved like intruders and announced themselves like a parade. 2 miles per hour in town, 4 in the country, and a man to walk ahead with a red flag or a lamp. If that sounds theatrical, that's because it was, and because it fit a world built for hooves and human legs, for the predictability of muscle and the slow negotiation of courtesy. Officials sounded confident because they thought they were right. A few heavy steam contraptions had spooked teams and scorched bystanders. The roads were narrow, rutted, muddy. A fast horse can be reasoned with, a fast boiler cannot. When the first petrol cars appeared, they were folded into the same mental drawer: novel, disruptive, unsafe. And in the summer of 1896, the year of the bicycle chase and the shilling fine, a woman named Bridget Driscoll stepped off a curb at Crystal Palace and became the first pedestrian in Britain killed by a motorcar. Witnesses said the car moved at a reckless pace, like a fire engine. The coroner, reaching for peace, said, "This must never happen again." So when you stand beside the bench with the magistrate and picture streets crowded with barrows and omnibuses, you can almost forgive the arrogance. Officials aren't paid to be poets. They are paid to manage risk. If the new thing brings speed and uncertainty, slow it down. Make it explain itself. Make it walk. And if it insists on running, catch it. By the turn of the century, members of Parliament were comfortable enough to say it out loud. The police, warned one, were not so much preventing offences as laying traps, even posting 1 or 2 constables in plain clothes as a decoy to induce people to commit them. In the Lords, the complaint turned acid. Policemen hidden in hedges or ditches on open roads, catching motorists like highwaymen. The stopwatch and the hedge were not rumours, they were a method. While Britain wrote careful, other people wrote diaries. A woman left her house in Mannheim before dawn with 2 sons and a plan her husband hadn't entirely approved. She put on a hat. She did not take a red flag. Her carriage had a single-cylinder heart and a taste for Ligroin, which no one sold at pumps because pumps didn't exist. There were apothecaries. She stopped at one in Wiesloch and bought fuel over the counter like medicine. When a line clogged, she borrowed a workshop, cleared it with a hat pin and moved on. When the brakes overheated, she stopped at a cobbler, explained the future, and paid for leather to line the shoes of a machine. Dogs ran alongside. People came to their doors. By nightfall, she was in Pforzheim, and the idea of motoring had gone from pamphlet to errand. If a car could carry a family 66 miles in a day on ordinary roads with nothing but wits, pins, and help from strangers, then it was not the laboratory trick. It was a domestic animal waiting to be tamed. That was 1888, when a flagman in Britain still walked 20 yards ahead, and a policeman's bicycle could beat a motor in court. 7 years later, a French engineer treated his country like a closed-loop laboratory. Paris to Bordeaux and back, nearly 1,200 kilometers in 2 days, driving through darkness and cold and dull pain. He arrived first, but could not be officially declared the winner because organizers had insisted on 4-seat machines, and his was a 2. The crowd didn't come to count seats.
They came to watch a machine hold together over a distance no horse could be asked to repeat without rest. Endurance creates its own applause. Imagine you are a British official, frowning over this in the paper. At home, you guard 2 miles per hour in towns. Across the channel, a man is doing 30 for hour after hour. Your skepticism becomes cargo. It has to be carried against proof. Proof throws dust.
Not everyone in Britain was content to stand on the pavement. One summer day in 1895, a man named Evelyn Ellis drove a Panhard-Levassor 56 miles from Micheldever to Datchet, with the engineer Frederick Sims beside him, noting how horses stared, snorted, and then, mostly, calmed down. It was a private experiment conducted in public, and it had the atmosphere of an escaped secret. An apothecary stop, a map across knees, a sense that one good journey could embarrass a bad law. By the end of that year, the National Motor Museum would later note, there were perhaps 14 or 15 cars on Britain's roads. You could write them on a pub chalkboard and still have room for the darts scores. In late 1896, the hedges rustled. Parliament loosened its grip. The flagman could go home. There would be a new national limit, 14 miles per hour for light locomotives, with local authorities free to trim it to 12. Men of means and appetite graduated from private runs to public ceremony. They organized themselves into a club grand enough to host dinners and practical enough to draw a route. On a November morning, they celebrated with a run from London to Brighton, a little theatre of movement. The red flag was now a prop rather than a rule. People grinned in their collars. Machines clattered into a new freedom and down to the sea. A parade is not a proof. A parade is hope in costume. The roads still shook bolts loose, engines still boiled water, cooked oil and sulked. Newspapers still had space for outrage. The police still kept stopwatches in their pockets. The law did not forget itself. If there was to be a public conversion, it would need more than a morning's joyride. The Automobile Club, newly founded in 1897, began to think like engineers and showmen at once. They needed distance, weather, hills and witnesses. They needed to take the argument out of drawing rooms and set it on a road where anyone could stand and watch. They needed what they started calling 1,000 miles, because 1,000 is a promise. Long enough to tell the truth, long enough that excuses will embarrass themselves. The plan was a loop, London to Scotland and back, with control points like toll booths where an official would stamp a paper and the people would stamp their feet to keep warm. The dates were printed, the towns learned the days the future would arrive. A clerk worked out how many number plates to prepare. The first secretary, Claude Johnson, later the steady hand behind Rolls-Royce, kept lists in a tidy hand while men in leather coats checked spares. Hyde Park Corner, 7 in the morning, Monday, 23rd of April, 1900. Horns coughed, engines barked and sighed. Drivers squinted up into a sky that couldn't decide whether to bless or punish. C.S. Rolls, serious and thin, posed with a panhard and a face that had no patience for a world limited to 14. S.F. Edge looked like a man who'd already cut his hands on this problem and found he liked it. Charles Jarrett had a calm that made photographers hurry. John Scott Montague, a member of Parliament with a Daimler and a stubborn habit of bringing his enthusiasms where they were not always welcome, made sure to be seen. A flag dropped. 65 cars set out, a caravan of doubt and curiosity, because half the crowd had come for a miracle and the other half for a farce. The first hours were a conversation between metal and mud. Springs snapped like breadsticks, chains slipped their sprockets and lay in the road like lazy snakes. Men wiped carburetors with their sleeves, blew on numb fingers, swore in low voices. At a control in the Midlands, the clerk's stamp grew heavy, but he did not stop because each arrival brought a little play. Will this one make it? Will the next one? In some towns, schoolchildren were given time to watch something nobody had planned to teach. On village greens, men who had come to shake their heads found themselves clapping dust off their gloves. If you stood by a control, you would hear a new music. The light clink of valve gear, the deeper thrum of big-bore cylinders, the hiss of a radiator cap easing pressure, the whistle of kettles carried for tea brewed in the lee of a wheel. You would see improvised repairs performed like folk magic, a bit of wire here, a sliver of leather there, nails peened flat with the back of a wrench, a hole plugged with rag and hope, and then, wonder of wonders, the engine catching again, as if the machine wanted to finish because the men did. 35 cars finished what they had started. That was the arithmetic that mattered. On the final day, the papers which had sneered changed their tone. Not everywhere at once, not everyone. But the sentence that England needed appeared. The motor had proved itself a serious and trustworthy means of locomotion. The words were not poetry, they were permission. They were relief. They were a stamp on a card that had been travelling longer than 1,000 miles. Montague had been arguing on the inside that motorists should be treated like citizens with responsibilities instead of criminals with tendencies. He had driven a car into the precincts of Parliament to make a point, bring the future to the door and ask it to be ignored. He wrote and spoke, and, when useful, embarrassed. He was not alone. The club had members with dinner jackets and friends in the press. The public had a new fondness for the machine that had just turned the country into a moving picture. Reason and spectacle joined hands and became policy, the British way. Slowly, carefully, with files drawn up and language negotiated like peace. Late in 1903, Parliament conceded the shape of the road ahead. It did not surrender. It set a limit at 20 miles per hour, high enough to recognise reality, low enough to reassure people whose sleep depended on the idea that modernity would mind its manners. It required number plates and driver's licenses. It gave the police clear lines to enforce. In the Commons, men still said the quiet part with pride or worry. The police were laying traps. In the Lords, critics made the metaphor plainer and uglier. Men hidden in hedges or ditches, like highwaymen. The hedge and the stopwatch were fixtures now, but so were plates on cars and licenses in pockets. The state and the machine had made their bargain. If this were a victory parade, you could stop here. The constable on the bicycle could rest. But there is an invoice the future presents to prudence, and Britain paid it. While it measured in careful increments, others measured in leaps. While British policemen timed motorists over 100 yards, French factories timed themselves over months. A 1,000-mile trial had been a public revelation. Across the Channel, revelation had been annexed by industry. By 1903, France was not merely making cars, it was making them at a pace you could count in shiploads, roughly 30,000 that year, about half the world's production. America stood well behind, at a little over 11,000, but with a look in its eye that would soon terrify bookkeepers. Britain, which had counted its cars by the dozen in 1895 and by the hundreds in 1900, was catching up. 700 or 800 on the roads by the turn of the century, tens of thousands licensed by 1909, but from far behind. Leadership is not a headcount. It is the habit of shaping the field. That habit belongs to countries that start early and apologize less. There's a picture that makes the point better than numbers. In 1903, when Britain wanted a proper international road race, it could not run one at home because road racing was illegal. The Gordon Bennett Cup retreated across the Irish Sea instead, where officials closed a triangular loop and let speed have its argument. The winning average was just about 49 miles an hour, 29 above the limit Westminster had just set. The constable steps from a hedge in Kent and writes out a summons for a man doing 22. A week later, spectators in County Kildare watch a car howl past at 2.5 times that speed and call it sport. Elsewhere, speed had become a frontier instead of a crime. The land speed records leaped from 76 to 84 miles an hour in 1902 and 1903. And then, on packed sand at Ostend in 1904, Louis Rigoli pushed beyond 100, a neat, round insult to anyone who thought the modern world could be kept at 20. The numbers weren't toys. They were research. When you push something fast, it breaks in ways that teach you how to build it strong. Back in Britain, the argument turned inward and clever. If traps were to be laid, and they were, the trapped sought ways to spring them safely. In 1905, the Automobile Association was founded for one primary purpose: help motorists avoid police speed traps. By 1907, uniformed patrolmen on bicycles were giving discreet signs beside hedges. When a court decided in 1909 that warning a driver could be obstructing an officer, the AA invented a code: salute members unless a trap was near, in which case the absence of a salute would be the warning. An organisation of respectable men in caps and leggings built a language to outwit the law's own vocabulary. Britain had gone from insisting that cars walk to teaching them how to wink. None of this made the roads safer by magic, and no one sensible said it did. Accidents continued, sometimes terrible, sometimes ordinary and sad. The new limit of 20 was widely ignored because, as a later minister dryly explained, a limit so widely disobeyed brings the law into contempt. But safety was not the whole subject. The subject was reality. The crowd had decided in 1900. The state caught up in 1903. The rest, how to paint lines, how to license drivers, how to set fines that bite but do not maim, how to keep the village green pleasant and the high road free, was administration. And Britain is good at administration when it wants to be. The part it wasn't good at was hurrying. If you walk back to the lane in Kent, you can still see the hedge. On one side is a blue coat and a bicycle bell, and a threadbare idea: order is a narrow road, and your job is to patrol it. On the other side is a car, whose noise frightens the dog and irritates the horse, and a driver who does not yet have a license, because licenses have not been invented. Between them is a stopgap. The stopgap lasted a decade. In that decade, other nations trained foremen, paid toolmakers, copied designs, made better ones, and taught the public that the right number on a dashboard was not 2 or 4, but whatever you could manage without hurting anyone. It helps to remember the faces. Rolls at Hyde Park Corner, skinny and intent, not yet a ghostly name above a radiator. Edge under a car in a lane, with dust on his sleeves, and the pleased exhaustion of a man making the day go his way by force. Jarrett, grinning through grit. Montague steering a Daimler into the yard at Westminster, not entirely because he needed to be there, but because the building needed to see what was coming. A clerk somewhere along the road in England, stamping the word "arrived" on the same car twice. Once when it pulled into a control, and once when the country, at last, admitted to itself that it wanted this. There is a temptation to tidy the moral. Britain strangled the motor revolution it could have led. That is true enough for a thumbnail, and brutal enough for a poster. It misses something important about how people change their minds. The establishment did not hate the car as such. It hated uncertainty. It hated noise. It hated shared space becoming contested space. It did what establishments do. It wrote rules to make the strange behave. It wrote them too tight. It kept them too long. Then it loosened them and pretended it had meant to do that all along. The public forgave the hypocrisy because the result worked. And yet, the invoice stands. By 1895, Britain had perhaps 15 cars. France, 8 years later, was building about 30,000 in a year, and America more than 11,000. By 1909, Britain had tens of thousands licensed and a skilled industry forming, but it would not own the first chapter the way it had owned the last century's opening paragraphs. Road racing would remain suspect. Irish loops would stand in for English straights. Records would fall on beaches and boulevards elsewhere. The nation that insisted on a man with a flag would find that, even with the flag gone, the world had got a mile or two ahead. Return to the opening scene. The constable is pedalling hard. The bell rings. The car is doing 8. The law says 2. In a courtroom, you cannot convict a mood, so you convict a man. A shilling and costs. The bench goes home pleased with itself. It has protected the public. Then a few years pass, and in the same building men grow uncomfortable with their own handiwork. Laying traps, someone says now, and it does not sound noble. In the upper chamber, an earl says, hidden in hedges or ditches, and highwaymen. and faces that once glowed with a sense of mission look down at their papers. Even Parliament, which never blushes willingly, begins to blush. The press writes its verdict: a serious and trustworthy means of locomotion. The words carry less romance than 1,000 cheering children on a town green, but they are the ones that matter, because legislation hears prose better than it hears poetry. The words give councils a way to approve a bylaw with their chins up. They let a policeman decide that today he will warn rather than trap. They let a magistrate set a fine without the little twist of pleasure he had once mistaken for courage. The road becomes a place where two contrary truths can live. Speed is wonderful, and speed is dangerous. The state becomes a place where two contrary reflexes can live: welcome and be careful. The public becomes a third thing. It wants both, and it learns to live with the friction of getting them. The ending is not triumphant, exactly. It is decisive. Britain went from insisting that cars walk to licensing them to run. It did so because people watched 1,000 miles and believed their own eyes, because engineers made machines that could survive bad days and return with their lamps still muddy, because a few stubborn men brought the future into rooms where it didn't feel invited. The constable on the bicycle did his duty. The drivers did theirs. The hedge kept its counsel. If you want one line to hold the whole matter, let it be simple. The British establishment began by treating the motorcar as a nuisance and ended by treating it as a citizen, not because of arguments in committee, but because the public watched it work. There is a small mercy at the end of this sort of story. The man with the red flag is not on the road anymore. He stands in a museum behind a rope, and small boys make siren noises as they pass. The flag does not flutter, it hangs dark and square, a warning stitched by a sensible century. It says, in effect, beware, something new is coming. The lesson, learned too slowly but learned, is written on number plates, on licenses, on the faces of people at bus stops who turn their heads at the familiar drone of a commuter's car. Beware. Welcome. Be careful. Make room. The hedge is still there, but the view is wider. And that chase at East Peckham? It makes a good opening, because it is small, and because it is honest. 8 against 2, a bicycle against a car, a fine against a feeling. A nation trying to keep the future in single file until it knows everyone's name.